Hey friends, my first website was a bunch of .html files inside a directory. All of it was hosted on a server somewhere in the States and I was deploying using FTP. Maybe you lived those days, maybe you remember them, maybe not, but those were the early days of the web, at least for me. If we translate this to today's terminologies, then that website was a static site hosted on a server. If you visit that site from the States, then it will be relatively quicker than if you visit it from Europe or Africa or Asia, because the server was physically far away from those users. Now, to solve this problem, I could have hosted the website on a CDN or a content delivery network that has several servers in different geographical regions to deliver content to end users based on proximity of this user. A CDN works by caching a copy of the website in several locations and it serves this content from a location that's closer to the user. Fast forward to today where we have tons of dynamic content that is generated on demand by a web server. Think of news websites and e-commerce websites, for example. Building an HTML for each news article or product listing is tedious amount of work. For this kind of dynamic content, you need to either automate the generation of the static HTML files and deploy them to your server, or cache the generated content in a CDN and refresh the cache on a fixed interval or when the page the page content needs to change. Generating the static files is called static site generation, or SSG for short. And there are plenty of static site generators nowadays like NextJS, Hugo, Gatsby, Jekyll, and the list goes on. And since the entire site is generated statically, you don't even need to have a server. You can host those static files on a CDN or on the edge, as we call it nowadays. The problem with static generation is that the build time can become too long if you have a lot of content to generate. Also, you have to generate the content every time a change happens. So on the other hand, many apps use server-side rendering or SSR to generate the content on demand and then cache this generated content on the edge. So the caching happens on the edge, not while building the website. Now, when a request is received by the CDN, it will check if the cached content is still valid and serve it right away. Otherwise, it will contact the server to render the response and then take the content, cache it, and serve it to future users. This means a higher TTFP, or time to first byte, when the response is not cached, of course. Now, developers need to optimize the rendering, database interactions, and server resources to improve the TTFP. Now, you may wonder, if the response is generated on build time or on demand via SSR and then cached, how can apps customize this response to display data that is based on the current logged in user? For example, to show the logged in username, weather in the city, local stock market updates, shopping cart content, and so on. Enter JavaScript. It was the answer to this problem and other problems. Using JavaScript, we can render parts of the pages or entire pages completely in the browser after the page is loaded from the CDN. When the user sends a request, the content is sent from the CDN, and then JavaScript loads the user-related content after that. Also, JavaScript makes the different page components interactive by listening to user clicks and input and updating the interface based on those interactions. And frameworks like Angular, Vue, and React allow us to perform this interactivity after the page loads. In fact, we went far with these frameworks and introduced single-page applications, or SPAs. Those applications run entirely in the browser. The user requests a page and the server responds with an empty HTML that references a JavaScript file. Once the browser loads the JavaScript file, it then renders the page content to the user. This is called client-side rendering. In SPAs, the browser won't need to reload the page on every user interaction, even when clicking links. The SPA framework will update parts of the page to reflect the changes and show different components based on the link the user clicks. This interactivity was a major user experience enhancement. But like everything else, it has its downsides. And the main one is having a low FCP score, or first contentful paint, which is the time from when the page starts loading to when any part of the page's content is rendered on the screen. When you deliver an SPA to the user, they will see a blank HTML page or a loader icon for some time until JavaScript kicks in and starts rendering some content. This and other factors affect the page's SEO score. It also means social media crawlers won't be able to read dynamic metadata of every page because the page loads with the same empty content until JS hydrates it. JS stands for JavaScript, by the way, if you're not familiar. Now, there are some solutions to SPA problems, but I personally don't think using SPAs is a good idea for publicly accessible content, like news articles, blog posts, and e-commerce websites. So now, I think we all know what the options are when it comes to building front ends to our applications. We have static generation, we have server-side rendering, and we have client-side rendering. Static generation is fast, but requires longer build time, and it's not convenient for data that changes too often. Server-side rendering requires maintaining a server to generate the content and a CDN to cache it and serve it. And both solutions cannot render user-related data. You will need a client-side rendering for that. Also, both solutions require full page reload when navigating between pages. SPAs took care of that and made the user experience much better, but SPAs have their own problems as well. Each of these patterns is better suited for something but not the other. So in a large web application that has public-facing pages as well as protected dashboards, you may have to mix between the three patterns. Save the home page statically on a CDN, render product pages server-side and cache them, and load user-related content client-side after the page loads. You may also use an SPA that uses SSR for the first page load and then continues in SPA mode for the rest of the user visit. In that case, you will have a better FCP score and better SEO, and at the same time you will have link clicks and form submissions, not triggering a full page load. The apps that use this pattern are called isomorphic apps. InertiaJS, which is a library that lets you build SPAs using React, Vue, and Svelte using classic server-side routing with Laravel or Ruby or Rails. This library also offers this isomorphic behavior by letting you run a node server that renders the JavaScript to HTML and returns it. The feature is currently in early access, but it's pretty obvious that there is a high demand for this pattern among different tech stacks. And frameworks like NextJS and NuxtJS give you the option to generate pages with any of the three patterns. You can generate pages with statically, other pages with server-side rendering, and some pages with client-side rendering. Other frameworks like Remix embrace server-side rendering and progressive enhancement. It loads all the data on the server before sending the HTML response to the browser, all while keeping the pages interactive using JavaScript. So many libraries and frameworks. It's good to have so many options, but it's a bit confusing when it's time to make a decision on which framework and pattern you should go for. I guess it takes some experience to master all this and be wise enough to make an educated decision on how you want to serve content to your users as fast as possible, while keeping the pages interactive and SEO friendly. My experience with front-end development has been mainly building SPA dashboards and admin panels that are secured behind authentication. For these dashboards, we didn't care about SEO at all and didn't give much attention to FCP. The user would wait a bit until the page loads, and then the SPA would make the experience better from this moment on. When the time comes and I need to build a front end for a public web app, I'd personally go for InertiaJS with SSR in front of a Laravel web application. And if it is only a front-end application, I'd go for NuxtJS since I am more comfortable with Vue than React. But that's me. What about you? Let me know what you think. What are you going to use to serve a kind of content that should be available for public access, like e-commerce websites and news websites? Anyway, I hope you learned something in this video, and I will see you in the next one.